Hello, my loves, and welcome to using trig to solve for angles. So the last few days we've been using trig to solve for missing sides, but today we're going to look at what's happening whenever we're solving for an angle instead. So on this problem right here, I want to solve for angle A. And to solve for angle A, we're going to do just like we've been doing with trig all week. First, we're going to label our sides opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is across from the 90, so I'm going to label that side 5 as H. Opposite means across from the angle we marked, so opposite A would be 3, which means 4 is our adjacent. Now we're going to determine what trig ratio works. Because we have all three sides labeled, we can use any of the trig ratios. I'm going to go ahead and use sine because I like sine the best. And I would say sine of my angle, which is A, is equal to my sine ratio, opposite, over hypotenuse. And now this time the variable we're solving for is inside that parentheses of sine. So to get rid of a trig function, when you're solving for the angle, what you do is the inverse function of that. And you're like, what is an inverse function? What does that look like? And what you do is there's a button on the calculator that says sine -1, and you're going to do that sine -1 to both sides. It cancels out over here to leave you with A, and then the other side turns into sine -1, or arc sine of 3/5. And now this is something you can type in your calculator. If you're using the Inspire, you still hit the trig button. Go to sine -1 of 3 divided by 5. And A would equal 36.8 degrees. So what function do we do to solve for each angle? So this is, I'm not going to have you look at a triangle for right now. I just want you to get used to seeing, hey, we're solving for the angle. I need to do the inverse trig of that function. So on number 1, we have tangent. So we're going to do the inverse tangent of both sides. Cancels out on the left to give us just u. And then we would have tangent -1 of 0.5317. And again, we're going to go type that into our calculator. We're going to hit tangent -1, 0.5317, and we're going to get u equals 28 degrees. On number 2, it says cosine of z. So again, we want to do the inverse of that trig function. We're going to do the inverse of cosine. So cosine -1, or arc cosine, cancels out on the left to give us just z. Goes over here and gives us inverse cosine of 0.0698. I type trig, inverse cosine, 0.0698 in my calculator, and I would get that z is equal to 86 degrees. On number 3, it says sine of y, so to get rid of sine, because we're solving for that variable inside the trig, we're going to do the inverse sine, or sine -1. And then we would get y equals sine -1 of 0, because 0.000 is just 0. And we get that y equals 0. Which is weird, but I'll take it. And then on number 4 as well, if you're looking, you have cosine of b. The variable is in the trig function, so to get rid of trig, we do inverse trig. Inverse cosine, we get b equals inverse cosine of 0.0872. Type that in your calculator, 0.0872, and you get b equals 85 degrees. So this is just whenever, hey look, it's already set up for you, just go ahead and do the inverse of both sides. Whenever you're solving for a missing angle, in this case question mark, you're going to still need to label your sides opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse, and figure out the trig ratio for yourself. So right here I'm going to mark my angle. Right there. My opposite would be directly across, or 32. My hypotenuse is across from the 90, so it's up here, which means 37 is my adjacent. I look at the sides that I have labeled, which are 32 and 37, or O and A. Based off SOHCAHTOA, I know that if I have O and A, it's tangent. So I'm going to say tangent of my angle, which is question mark, equals opposite over adjacent. And now I go, okay, I'm solving for the angle. It's inside the trig. I need to do the inverse trig. So I'll do the inverse trig of both sides. I'll get question mark equals inverse tangent of 32 over 37. And now I have something I can type straight into my calculator. I do inverse tangent of 32 over 37, and I get question mark equals 40.9. Now I want to take a moment to look at the rounding. What I actually got in my calculator was 40.8554. I'm rounding to the nearest tenths place. But remember to round, you underline the place that you're looking at. You look 1 to the right. If it's 5 or higher, you go up, which is why it changed into a 9. If it's 4 or below, you go down. So if that had been 8.84, you would have left it as 0.8, but because it was 0.85, you went up to 0.9. All right, now I'm solving for the missing angle again. So again, I'm going to mark my angle. My hypotenuse is across from 90 degrees, so I mark that with an H. My opposite is across from the angle, and then my adjacent is next to the angle. So this time, I have the O and the H side labeled, which tells me it's going to be sine. So I set up my trig ratio. Sine of question mark equals opposite, or 33, over hypotenuse, or 36. And now I'm solving for something inside that trig function, so I'm going to do the inverse of the trig function to cancel it out. Question mark would equal inverse sine of 33 over 36. I have something I can go ahead and type into my calculator. And I'm going to round to the nearest tenth, which would give me question mark equals 66.4. And again, one last one to solve for missing angle. You mark your angle, label your sides O, A, and H. Here's my opposite, here's my adjacent, here's my hypotenuse. Determine what trig function you're using. I have A and H labeled, which tells me it's going to be cosine. Cosine of my angle is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. I'm solving for something inside the trig, so I need to do inverse trig. On both sides, question mark would equal cosine -1 of 27 over 60. Gives me something to type into my calculator. And I would get question mark equals 63.2563. Rounded to my nearest tenth, question mark would equal 63.3, because again, I'm rounding to the nearest tenths place. Look to the 5. That 5 would bring me up to a 3. Now, I understand that you guys might not all have these school calculators, so here are some good sites for using your inverse trig. You have wolframalpha.com or desmos.com. Those are pretty easy. You can just type it in as is. You can also use your TI Inspire software link if you have the download. If you don't have it downloaded, email your teacher and we'll forward you the instructions so that you can use the calculator so you're using the same type we use at school. If you want to use a different calculator, that's fine. Just make sure you're using a calculator that can accurately do these inverse functions. That is it for today. Let me know if you have any questions.